Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Alex Frelas, and I'm joined by my colleague here, Jack Butler, and we're presenting on COVID-19 tracing apps, the proliferation of rush development. Now, a little bit about ourselves. I'm directing a penetration testing team. I'd like to consider myself technical as well as managerial. Some of my interests lie in web application testing, aviation testing, and just enjoying the outdoors.
And my name is John Butler. I'm a mobile application security specialist, and I have a strong background in the prevention of reverse engineering of mobile applications. I currently work as a security specialist for a leading firm in the mobile application security space named GuardSquare. And much of the research and the takeaways that we're presenting on here today were conducted alongside my peers and as part of my daily duties at GuardSquare.
So to get things kicked off, we're going to actually go over a brief overview of what we hope to accomplish during this conversation and just give you guys a little bit more of backdrop and some context to work off of. So the first thing we want to cover is the actual purpose of today's conversation and the purpose of contact tracing applications in general. For anybody here who doesn't know what a contact tracing application is, it's meant to actually trace individuals who do or do not have COVID. But more importantly, alert users or specific individuals that are using the application of potential exposures to other users that are within a proximal location. Now, just in order to address rollout history, COVID-19 contact tracing applications have started to appear since the actual pandemic began. We've seen a number of different changes over the course of time with regards to the tools that are available in order to actually build security in to core functionality of these applications. And we'll discuss this during our conversation here today as well. We're also going to be touching upon different application variants. So something that you're going to notice is that there are many different COVID-19 contact tracing applications, not one unified application of any sort. So we see this is actually occurring on country by country basis, but also state levels within the United States, adding to the confusion of which one do you actually download. We're going to be touching on the importance of trust today. It's a very important thing. If COVID-19 contact tracing applications are going to be adopted and used as a effective utility for fighting this pandemic, then users need to trust that the applications are built with security and privacy in mind. And these are some of the contingencies that we'll also discuss today. Moving on to, just information collected by the application, we're going to, of course, be diving into our findings on a very granular level, the controls that we analyzed within the applications, the apps themselves, information that was collected by the applications that we view to be an overstep, and more. And that really ties into and folds nicely into our final point here, which is just brokenness of COVID-19 contact tracing applications, many of the security and privacy concerns that we've observed, and recommendations for how we can improve in the future.
So now that we've provided a general overview of what we're going to be discussing today and what we hope to accomplish in today's conversation, we can actually move on to a general overview of our testing approach. So to help you better understand our testing approach, we're going to be going over together the apps that we analyzed, as well as the actual overview of controls studied, so the actual protection mechanisms that we were looking for inside of these applications. And then we're also going to review a summary of findings and an overview of the data that we were able to collect and analyze as a result of this research. The first thing I would like to do is provide you with a timeline of the actual applications that we analyzed so that you can better understand the entire backdrop of the research and the story that goes behind it. So Back in June of 2020, I actually had the opportunity to analyze 14 of the original COVID-19 applications. Now, at the time, these were actually just APKs, so the data was limited to Android. This was certainly enough to pique interest in the privacy and security concerns that reside in the space, and definitely made myself, my colleagues, very interested to see how this would progress into the future. So in December of 2020, myself and my colleagues analyzed the same 14 original APKs that we took a look at. We extended that by taking a look at another 38 Android applications. And we also extended the data set by introducing 43 new iOS contact tracing applications to provide some telemetry there. So in general, and to provide a real breakdown, we analyzed 95 applications in total. The majority of these were government orchestrated contact tracing applications. But it's actually important to note that they weren't all countries. So it's not just country by country. We actually do have 13 US states, as well as 2 US territories. So there were many different applications, and this actually adds to some of the confusion behind finding the correct application and the opportunity behind the phishing campaigns that we've observed, which we'll discuss later throughout this conversation. Now, for anybody interested in a more granular spread of what applications we actually took a look at, I've gone ahead and I've enumerated all of those applications on this slide here, so you can see both Android and iOS, the applications by country, by name, or by state and name, US territory and name. So you can actually take a closer look at all the different individual applications that we analyzed as part of this this presentation, as part of this analysis that we're discussing here today. Now, I'd like to start by providing a brief introduction on the Exposure Notifications API, which was created by Apple and Google back in May of 2020. I've provided a link to the developer documentation for anybody who's interested in taking a peek at this. And this was actually created in order to unify the way in which application developers go about creating secure contact tracing applications, and specifically was designed with a couple goals in mind, so security, privacy, and safety. So safely and securely notify individuals of potential exposures to COVID-19, but also to actually reduce and limit the collection of private user information, which simply isn't necessary, but was also observed in the existence of early COVID-19 contact tracing applications. Now, the implementation of this API is very simple. It's a secure Bluetooth implementation. It doesn't collect any other information at all. And if you're actually interested in learning more about how this works, you can take a look at the link that I've provided here, though it is very simple, straightforward, and this won't be the primary point of the conversation that we drive here today. Now, as we discussed on the previous slide, the Exposure Notification API had a couple goals in mind, and tying into that slide, we're going to discuss a little bit more in depth what the expectations of this API were when it was created, and then what the actual outcomes and the actual results that we observed in the wild are. So hopping into the actual expectations, Google and Apple clearly had expected that by providing core functionality for developers to actually make secure contact tracing applications using this secure Bluetooth mechanism that they provided in this very convenient API, that health organizations and the majority of the world would actually adopt the API and use it. Of course, and as mentioned, the API's goal was to provide that core functionality for building secure applications. Providing this API was a major innovation, and going back to trust, it's very important that users who download COVID-19 contact tracing applications can actually trust that those applications are secure and that they're private. So Google and Apple genuinely possess the belief that by designing applications with security and privacy top of mind, customers or users rather who consume those applications will see value, they will trust those applications, and it will actually drive the utility of contact tracing applications in helping prevent the spread of this disease. Now, in terms of the applications that we analyzed and the subset of data that we're discussing today, of the applications we analyzed, 60% of those apps did indeed use the exposure notification API provided by Google and Apple. So 62% of Android applications and 58% of iOS applications. However, 40% neglected to use the exposure notification API, and they instead took a do-it-yourself approach to security. They completely neglected the core functionalities provided to them by Google and Apple. And in many cases, they're actually these applications, several of them that we analyzed, are collecting unnecessary additional pieces of user information, which we'll cover in later slides. So suffice it to say, there were significant security and privacy concerns, specifically within the 40% of applications that did not use the exposure notifications API. And this is going to be the main focus and center of our conversation today. So as opposed to focusing on the 60% of apps which actually did use the exposure notification API, we're actually going to be zooming in on the 40% which deliberately elected not to use that.
So finally, with regards to our testing approach, I would like to actually cover the individual controls studied and the actual security mechanisms that we tried to take a look at with regards to the individual applications that we analyzed. So I have gone ahead and actually listed the individual features that we were looking for in these individual applications, and I'll actually take some time in order to discuss each of these features, their importance, the value add, and we can go from there. So starting at the top with string encryption, it's very important to utilize string encryption to replace sensitive context that might reveal secure operations inside of the application. Now, a perfect example of this that we see in applications very regularly is API endpoints. API endpoints can be, and other sensitive strings can be returned through reflection and can otherwise appear throughout the application as well. It's very important to replace any of these strings with encrypted representations that are entropyless, that are meaningless, so that attackers cannot easily enumerate these using tools like Bucksmolly, using tools like the native Unix command strings, or others like Radari as well. Now, name obfuscation is a very basic feature. It is provided by open source optimization tools such as ProGuard, but it is really only designed to modify the names of common identifiers of classes, methods, fields, and things of the sort. That said, it still adds a level of complexity to your application so that when attackers do disassemble your code, the package structure and the names of classes, methods, fields, and things of that sort are not immediately obvious. Now, data at rest encryption is very important if you do have sensitive files or sensitive information that is stored in, for example, SQLite files. Those should, of course, be encrypted at rest. Otherwise, what you're actually going to find is that those files are effectively unencrypted. And this is something that we did notice in a number of the COVID contact tracing applications, is that they do collect sensitive information that's not necessary. They do store it completely unencrypted, and these are some of the privacy concerns that we'll discuss later. Moving on to RASP, which stands for Runtime Application Self-Protection. These are also known as resiliency features. So if you adhere to a security framework such as the Mobile Application Security Verification Standard by OWASP, you can actually take a look at the Mobile Security Testing Guide. What you're going to find in there is that there are resilience guidelines. These resilience guidelines are specifically aimed to help organizations implement robust security controls to protect their applications both statically and dynamically against online and offline attacks. Now, we are really going to be taking a look at two features in particular. That's going to be root detection and jailbreak detection. So those are the equivalent feature on either platform, Android and iOS. And of course, these forms of runtime checks are going to ensure at all entry points in the application that if it is opened, ideally it should crash on a jailbroken or a rooted Android device. Similarly, emulator checks are designed in order to ensure that if the application is executed on an emulated device, for example, ADB, it will crash inside of that emulated environment. So we'll actually take a look at this. We'll see how many applications actually did use robust controls like this and how many didn't. And we're also going to be taking a look at SSL pinning. SSL pinning is very important to secure communications and information traveling over the wire between the application and a backend. So if you are serializing inputs, if you are sending sensitive information over the wire, it's very, very important to actually pin your application to its backend, either using a certain number of public keys or certificates. And it's also very important to further secure those implementations so that they cannot later be patched out, which is very common. Finally, we have arrived at app attestation. App attestation just allows for the possibility of actually distinguishing that the application itself is receiving a legitimate connection from the application or from an instance of that application itself. So a great example of this is Google Safety Net. And this is just one of the many things that we did take a look at inside of the applications that we analyzed. So with this in mind, we're now going to move on to an overview of the data that we gathered and summarize some of those results for you.
So now that we've explained our testing approach and our methodology, we're going to go into a full overview of the data and the analysis that we actually performed, as well as the takeaways that we were able to derive from analyzing that data. So hopping directly into the data, you can actually see here on our first slide, we are taking a look at the Android applications. Now, of all of the 40% of applications that fell into the category which did not use the exposure notification API, we did take a look at 20 do-it-yourself Android applications. And of them, we have actually mapped the different percentage of those applications that adhered to the controls that we were looking for and possessed these different protection mechanisms. And it's very clear that on the Android side of the house, most applications don't possess these protections and therefore additionally possess weak security posture. Piggybacking off the last slide, you can see on this slide that we've provided a number of applications and a percentage of applications which adhere to the control mechanisms that we took a look at on the previous slide. So, for example, you can actually see that 95% of these applications possess 2 or fewer of the protections that we were looking at. Now, please do bear in mind that the slide that we're reviewing right now is just the Android portion of the applications that we looked at, but just from a 30,000-foot view of the 40% of applications that we analyzed which did not use the exposure notification API, 95% of those applications used 2 or fewer protections, meaning they're not building these applications with security or privacy in mind, and actually 0 of them had 5 or more of these protections. So now taking a look at the iOS side of the house, you can see that we have equivalently provided the same control mechanisms that we looked at for the Android side. And in the top right-hand corner, you're going to see that for the iOS side of the house, we actually analyzed 18 do-it-yourself iOS applications. By do-it-yourself, we mean these applications deliberately elected not to use the exposure notification API and instead elected to implement controls themselves. Now, what you can see is that most of these features are actually implemented very conservatively across the applications that we analyzed, and actually app attestation and name obfuscation just simply don't appear at all. So once again, on the iOS side of the house, we are very quickly realizing that robust security does not seem to exist inside of the majority of these contact tracing applications. And now, once again, you can see that we have provided the same chart that we did for Android in order to display the number of applications and the percentage of applications which actually adhered to a certain number of the controls that we were looking for. So in this case, we can actually see that 61% of the iOS applications that we looked at, so 11 of the 18, actually possessed 2 or fewer controls, and in general, 94% of these applications possessed 2 or less. So on the Android side, we can see that 95% of those applications, and on the iOS side, we can see that 94% of those applications possess 2 or fewer of the controls that we were looking for. Once again, representing that these COVID app contact tracing applications are not being built with security in mind. Now, beyond the lack of security controls, which we were able to highlight in previous slides, we also believe that privacy concerns should be a large portion of today's conversation and should be illuminated. So we're going to take a look at GPS privacy concerns, which we observed in a number of these different contact tracing applications. And we're going to start by calling out the fact that many GPS apps, or a number of the GPS apps that we observed, actually collect additional user information which is not necessary, such as a passport number, phone number, a device ID, or other pieces of valuable information which aren't required to anonymously notify users of potential exposure. Additionally, those sensitive pieces of information were in some cases stored insecurely, such as in unencrypted SQLite databases, or potentially leaked in other ways, making them effectively unencrypted rather. So it's very safe to say that this is definitely a privacy concern. These applications actually don't need to collect additional information, which is the point of the exposure notification API, which only relies on Bluetooth and does not collect any other sensitive pieces of user information. And with that being said, this can actually call into question the safety of these applications and potentially hinder the value of contact tracing applications when it comes to combating the pandemic itself. So in summarizing the results, there was a gross lack of static protection amongst the applications that we analyzed. And you were able to very clearly see that based on the data in the previous slides, based on the controls that we looked at in the very low percentage of applications that actually contained those. Similarly, the runtime protections were poorly implemented, and in most cases, and in many cases, they were just not implemented at all, meaning that both static reverse engineering of applications, disassembling and understanding code, making changes to that code would be very feasible and trivial for attackers. Exploitation at runtime, so whether it be attaching debuggers, opening it on a rooted or an emulated device, modifying and tampering with files, hooking functions and things of that sort, once again would all be very easy at runtime. We also noticed exposed API endpoints, which makes data in transit a concern. As we mentioned, several of these applications are not only collecting GPS information, but also sensitive user information. And if you're not implementing SSL pinning, which most of these applications certainly were not, then data in transit is a concern. And even if you do implement SSL pinning, if you don't have the robust protections, both static and dynamic, needed to secure those implementations and prevent attackers from just patching them out, either statically or at runtime by, for example, hooking those functions, then once again, these SSL pinning implementations will simply be bypassed. So returning to the first 2 points, the lack of static and dynamic protection is a large concern, which leads to greater issues. String encryption, for example, would be able to very easily encrypt the strings or the API endpoints, very quickly mitigating this risk. Finally, we were able to identify multiple different instances of rogue applications. So in our sources, we have provided links to a number of different cases of rogue applications that are floating under the veil of COVID-19 legitimate governing bodies and applications for users. But in actuality, they're masquerading as those legitimate sources, hoping that unsuspecting victims will download and install their rogue application and grant them permissions into either their Android or iOS device. Now, we've also seen instances of ransomware appearing, once again, under the veil of COVID-19. So you can see CryDroid instances that have occurred. So this is something to bear in mind. Once again, if these governing bodies are not hardening their applications, then it's very easy for attackers to very quickly modify them and use them as portions of phishing campaigns that can be used to actually stage more sophisticated attacks downstream.
Some other observations that we made throughout our testing and research was, first of all, that application security is not determined by a nation's wealth. So for example, if we look at Israel, who's number 32 out of 196 in terms of GDP in the year 2020, they had significantly worse application security than some of the countries in Africa who had their own contact tracing app. Now that's contrary to what we thought. We thought that a country who had high GDP had a lot of money for developing a contact tracing app securely, but that's not the case. Second of all, GDPR and HIPAA violations were noticed, especially in the DIY apps. England's was one. Their test and trace program broke GDPR data laws because they weren't adhering to GDPR regulations as it pertained to the storage and processing of data. Now, thirdly, there's the encouragement of waiving data privacy rights. There are users who are downloading these applications thinking that they're robust with security and privacy in mind, but that's not the case. So there needs to be transparency, and there wasn't in terms of how privacy was being handled. Let's move on to flawed development and integration. We clearly noticed that development teams were having difficulties in a variety of areas. First of them being timeline sensitivity. With the pandemic picking up in pace, development had to be rushed to get a working application out as soon as possible. The sprints, as a result, were focused on fixing functionality or creating that functionality, leaving little consideration for security in that time. The second thing we noticed was that the development team had to choose between their approach to constraints, whether they wanted quality, which would require a long development time, or if they wanted a short release time, but as a result, control the spread and potentially save human lives. The third difficulty that we saw these development teams have was the fact that this was such a unique solution. There hadn't been a contact tracing app before that had to be released on such a large scale. There was no previous poster child. I don't think that a developer could go onto Stack Overflow and get the necessary code and call it a day. So that wasn't really possible there. And the fact that these applications were handling sensitive data, this had to be looked at in terms of privacy. Some applications, of course, considered privacy and security very well, others didn't. But either way, there had to be some sort of consideration for that sensitive data, even at minimum. The rush to development of these contact tracing applications didn't come without any effects. There's actually quite a few effects that came about as a result. As I mentioned in the last slide, there was a main focus on functionality of the applications and a limited regard for security and privacy as a result, just mainly because the goal was to develop an application as soon as possible and release it to the public. Furthermore, there was a lacking of features that would allow for integration with other apps or COVID apps. Let's say the European Union wanted all of Europe's countries to integrate into one application. This wouldn't be possible because this integration feature wasn't built in. However, as a result, less time was spent on development, which means that getting to the controlling of the spread happened sooner. So you can claim that as a benefit. Lastly, there's an ethical dilemma. These developers know that there's a known risk of security in these applications, yet they're still releasing it. Well, the question is, do you release an app that is unhardened due to lack of time and money? On one hand, the spread might be thwarted, but at the same time, it's opening doors for a long-term headache if these people's data gets stolen. And you have to weigh the long-term effects against the short term in that case. Let's move on to recommendations for time-boxed development. So the first recommendation is to unify apps, and that can be done in one of two ways, or both. The first being using a common API, and the second being consolidating apps. So the first way is, using one of Google's or Apple's APIs, also known as the Notification Exposure API, or similar. Now I put an asterisk there because I believe that it doesn't necessarily have to be a private company solution. It could be a public government created solution. But either way, global issues should be fought on a global scale. There should be that common API that should be utilized when it's there. The second, as I'd mentioned, is consolidating apps. There's way too many apps on the app stores. Users have trouble knowing which one's legitimate, which one's not, and the fact that there's so many state level apps, that's just contributing to the issue. And to that, we're just saying, no, let's skip not having these state level apps. Country is fine, but making sure that it's utilizing the common API and not a do-it-yourself one. Anybody who's not complying with this, our thoughts are that they should be fined. There's going to be proposed contact tracing app requirements, and anybody who's not adhering to them should be fined. The second thing we'd like to recommend is a security-focused SDLC. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what an SDLC is, it's a software development lifecycle, and it's typically found in companies and pertains to how development goes from start to finish. We're particularly recommending a shift-left approach, which means including security earlier and at every phase, meaning that it's everywhere, and that it's a forethought, not an afterthought. We're recommending that teams aren't siloed, so if there's a security team, we want them to work with a development team and for communication to be facilitated. There doesn't have to be a pick one approach to choosing either functionality or security. You can have both, and that's the fact that these development and security teams can work in parallel together, especially when new features are being released. There could be an iterative approach where security is constantly being checked in these features. One thing that would allow for security tests in these types of feature releases is something called a technical security review, which documents that there's been scanning in the code that's been performed, documents the inter-service communication. Let's say the service has to communicate with another service, that will be documented there, along with any scanning results, testing that had been done. If there is no software development life cycle, in the case that a company doesn't have to adhere to, let's say, PCI regulations or HIPAA, what have you, then typically you can hook it into an existing change management process. You can hook security processes into that because whenever there's an application that gets added to an inventory, let's say, typically there's a change management process for that. And very similarly, you can just include security aspects to be included in that.
Now, with regards to development requirements, we have a number of recommendations that we would provide, starting with adhering to some form of security standard or security framework like OWASP. So you can take a closer look at, for example, OWASP, Mobile Application Security Verification Standard, or the Mobile Security Testing Guide, which both will act as an excellent blueprint for security specialists that are looking to implement robust controls inside of their mobile applications. And then also, as mentioned in the second point here, add resilience to that application so that it can stand up to and defend itself from sophisticated attackers, both statically and dynamically. Now, we also recommend employing a masked scanning solution so that you can identify vulnerabilities in code and actually remediate those. And we also then recommend implementing a code hardening solution. So as we were able to illuminate earlier and identify, most of the applications we're taking a look at here don't have any form of obfuscation, string encryption, runtime application self-protection mechanisms, or other basic security components which would be useful in deterring bad actors. So by employing a code hardening solution, you can make it infeasible for those attackers who are actually looking to make modifications and nefariously attack those applications. And lastly, we hope that the final product through these recommendations will be a more safe and secure, privacy-focused application that earns the trust of its users and overall results in improved adoption and utility in combating this pandemic.
Now, on the previous slide, we recommended a code hardening solution. And the reason for this is that in all fairness and in our honest experience, we can tell you that most teams, while they do have what's needed to build a functional application, don't have what they need to implement robust security controls. In fact, most development teams are focused on functionality and performance of that application. But it's very important to consider that these government bodies who should actually be employing robust security controls to protect their user base should be using a code hardening solution. Code hardening solutions, like some of the ones that I'm about to recommend, will actually allow you to implement robust security controls in a very short amount of time. More than that, what I can say is that as most of these security teams don't possess in-house specialization in the area, they don't have the manpower to keep up with the evolving threat landscape. So just the updates with Magisk and checkrain and jailbreaking rooting of devices alone can be a very mighty task for development teams to manage. This is why by outsourcing this type of work to a specialist firm or an actual enterprise grade solution, you can receive all the benefits of those protections, and you can actually get wonderful support when you need it. It'll all be maintained for you, and you can really just focus on implementing the features which are necessary as opposed to managing security, which quite frankly, most of these governing bodies are woefully unprepared to do. So getting into the actual meat and potatoes of today's slide, besides the why for code protection, I think that's clear. These governing bodies need to harden their code. They need to protect the sensitive user data if they're going to collect it in the first place, which they shouldn't be. And regardless, they need to earn the trust of their user bases to further drive adoption. So with that in mind, to provide an agnostic recommendation, again, and you can look up different code hardening solutions, I highly recommend GuardSquare. GuardSquare is the leader in mobile application protection, offering code hardening solutions, both obfuscation and encryption, runtime application self-protection, real-time threat event monitoring, and application scanning solutions for both iOS, Android, Unity, and hybrid applications alike. So if you are operating on a mobile platform, I highly recommend reaching out to GuardSquare, scheduling a demo. You can feel free to reach out to me. And with that in mind, we can actually help you address not only your pain points, but how we can help you address those pain points by implementing robust security controls.
Now, tying into the topic of the previous slide in code hardening, really folding into this is the idea and the importance of actually adopting the triple constraint. And the triple constraint is the idea of balancing time, cost, and quality. But in practice, we often find that you really many times can only pick two. So I think this pandemic situation really underscored a perfect use case whereby they just didn't have enough time. They rushed applications to market. They didn't put money into specialized security knowledge or enterprise grade code hardening solutions that really could help implement these solutions. And as a result, they really suffered in the quality department. If they had implemented security properly and actually standardized the way they went about things from the get-go, if they had employed the correct specialists in order to do this, then they really wouldn't have had these problems. But it comes down to the fact that they haven't spent money on these solutions in order to fix the problem correctly. The second thing that's important to acknowledge is that it's not always just a matter of time or money. It's a matter of skill. And so with that in mind, it's very important to accept the fact that many teams don't have the specialized in-house knowledge for security. They're development teams, and that's totally fine. Development is one thing, security is a completely another thing. And it's completely fine to outsource this and to buy an SDK that allows you to properly secure your mobile application. Developers buy SDKs all the time for the purpose of saving time and not having to put specialists into actually designing that thing. So really, security should not be viewed differently. If you don't have the knowledge to implement it yourself, you should purchase the solution from somebody else, or at least governing bodies who are producing what are supposed to be legitimized applications that are safe and secure for users. They should be doing this. And lastly, is just it's very important to avoid the do-it-yourself scenario as much as possible, because we're finding that most of the time sophisticated attackers find a way to bypass that. So if you don't have a solution that is backed by research and is tested in many environments, then attackers are going to very quickly bypass that do-it-yourself implementation using instrumentation tools and other methods, and it's really not going to get you very far. So with this in mind, it's advisable to once again use a code hardening solution, especially in the event that you don't have specialization. In many cases, it's a whole lot cheaper than employing a bunch of specialists to do it in-house, but also the solution will be managed for you. You can get support, and in many times it just equates to less effort in that sense as well.
If you enjoyed the topic of this presentation, we'd like to recommend some ideas for future projects that you can take on yourself. Quite simply, vaccine passport applications. They're very similar to contact tracing applications, but they've had more development time as they're not time pressed in terms of development as they're racing against the surging pandemic. They're also more unified, meaning that a whole region such as the European Union is only relying on one application versus a multitude. But there's still a reason to be skeptical because we've seen the way that the development approach has been for the contact tracing applications. Despite there being more time, it doesn't necessarily mean that development has included security practices and processes. Some test cases we'd like to recommend there is seeing if you can change the approval status of uploaded COVID tests, and also seeing if you can bypass the proof of vaccination validation, where I believe you upload a picture of your vaccination card